Today I want to talk about Linux. More specifically, I want to talk about why many professional software developers use and sometimes even prefer to use a Linux-based operating system for their work over other operating systems. By the end of the video, you should have a much better understanding of what a Linux-based operating system is to begin with, what the typical use cases for it are, and why there is such a following surrounding the operating system. With the preamble out of the way, let me preface the video with this. While I may strongly prefer Linux-based operating systems for both professional and personal use over Windows, I do not believe that the infamous flame wars between Linux users and basically everyone else make any sense at all. And if you haven't seen them yet, the flame wars get huge. The Linux user community really likes to gatekeep people even within the community, and the well actually memes about Linux users are often true. This joke in particular shows quite clearly why the community has a bad name. So, with this video, I hope to shed light on Linux's usefulness without telling you that your OS choice is wrong. So, without any further ado, let's begin. Alright, before we can really talk about why people use Linux-based operating systems, we need to understand what an operating system is, what Linux is, and why Linux is important. An operating system is a set of software that provides all the necessary infrastructure to make your computer useful. The most famous examples are Mac OS and Windows operating systems. These operating systems come with a lot of built-in software to manage your peripherals, run your programs, manage your computer's power states, manage your file system, and a lot more. This is quite obviously a very brief summary, but at the very least it gets us to be on the same page about the absolute basics. And as far as the average consumer goes, this is honestly enough to understand it to be able to reason about things in your daily life. However, you did click on this video, so you're likely not an average consumer, so we need to dig deeper to really get to the point. What I described so far is the overall operating system along with a desktop environment. Each operating system is a combination of the OS kernel and the application layer on top of the kernel. The operating system kernel is effectively a program that manages the absolute basics of your computer. It is what decides what gets run and how, it sets up the infrastructure for processes, and it controls the absolute basics without which your computer is just sand with lightning in it in a pretty box. All the other programs have to be run on the computer somehow, so the kernel exposes an API, or an application programming interface, that lets the programs do more complicated things that the kernel enables. Something as simple as saving a document in a word processor will require a system call to the kernel to write some information out to a file. As an end user, you likely will never have to interact with the kernel in any way directly, but almost all software that does anything meaningful will have to interact with the kernel in some way. So, to quickly wrap up this specific part and make sure we are on the same page, when you are running Windows, the Start menu is an operating system provided program. So is the File Explorer and the Task Manager, but none of these are the operating system kernel, even if each program I mentioned so far does interact directly with the Windows kernel. Finally, with that out of the way, I can start talking about Linux. Linux is an open source kernel developed by Linus Torvalds in 1991. This is the reason that the Linux is not an operating system unto itself copy pasta exists, because it is true. Linux is just a kernel. But for all intents and purposes, if you refer to a Linux distribution as Linux, everyone will get what you mean. Anyways, back on topic, Linux is the kernel that provides a different set of syscalls to the Windows kernel, which is different to the FreeBSD kernel that Mac OS is based on. Another cool thing besides Linux being free, like actually completely free, and open source is that it has an awesome commercial license permitting companies to modify it for their needs. Additionally, the Linux kernel has seen very wide adoption in both industry and academia, and is thus quite mature at this point. With the rise in Linux's popularity, many fully fledged operating system distributions have sprung up. We'll get to those a bit later, but a name you might recognize is Ubuntu, and another might be Arch Linux, even if it's just from the memes. At this point, you know quite a bit about Linux itself, so let's talk about its uses next. As I already mentioned, the Linux kernel is typically distributed in Linux operating system distributions. Now let me tell you, there are thousands of distributions for all sorts of different use cases. Let's start with a couple somewhat reasonable consumer-side uses. First that comes to mind is breathing new life into old or weaker hardware. Some Linux distributions are very light on system resources, requiring something like a couple hundred megabytes of RAM to work well. This is actually one of the reasons that I use Linux quite a bit myself. I have a lot of older laptops that really feel sluggish and disappointing with Windows. Another reason could be that you just do not want to pay Microsoft or have their OS gather all kinds of data about you. Most Linux distributions actually come with peer-reviewed software that has been checked for both vulnerabilities and privacy issues. The community of people using Linux really cares about privacy, so that could be a good reason to try it out. Oh, and I don't think I can mention Linux-based operating systems without addressing a common criticism. It is the phrase, Linux is only free if you do not value your own time. This criticism is typically addressing the fact that Linux can break, and it is on you to fix the issues. You know what? This is a valid concern, but with the advent of such distributions like Pop! OS, Mint, and Cinnamon, user-friendliness of Linux is very good now, to some extent making this criticism less of an issue. Another thing is that Linux breaking for people is sort of down to luck. I personally had more occasions where Windows was not behaving in a way that makes any sense than Linux, and typically I would only break my Linux installs when I would be doing something that a lot of resources told me not to do. Oh, and one last thing, when something does break in Linux, it is actually possible for me to fix it, which is rarely the case in Windows. But that is very besides the point. My main point is that your mileage may vary, and Linux is really not for you if you're already happy with Windows or macOS. Do not switch if you do not have to and do not want to. Anyways, let's get back on track. Last consumer level use of Linux is for tinkerers. If you like to just play around with your computer, then you can do so with Linux very easily, since the operating system is highly customizable and you can tinker with almost everything. And now let's move on to the more commercial uses of Linux. First is in servers. Most servers run Linux, partly because enterprises do not want to run random closed source Microsoft software, especially when it is not easy to develop for and modify for server grade uses, and partly because it is free. Next is the use in high availability systems. Since the Linux kernel is small and quite robust, you can make a super compact operating system that you can fully understand end to end and virtually make sure that the overall system will not go down at random. Think of places like medical equipment, military equipment, and certain servers and so on. You really want something stable that will always be on. Next is in the development of your own consumer OS. Since you can modify the kernel to tailor it to your needs, you can build an entire OS on top of it to fit a specific use case. As an example, just look at the Android operating system. It is based on Linux kernel. Yet another use is in the Internet of Things and other embedded devices. Those devices typically will have fewer resources, so they will run as minimal of an OS as they can just to make sure that the basics are covered and nothing else. With this in mind, I think you should have a decent grasp of what Linux can be used for. So now let's talk about why developers use it and often actually like to use it. As was discussed already, the commercial uses of Linux are many, and developers have to work with what they got. But that's not the entire story. I mean, there is an obvious set of people that develop either the Linux kernel or a Linux-based operating system professionally, and you would imagine that they would be using the system that they develop. After all, how else do you verify that what you're making is any good if not for eating your own dog food? But as I said, that is not the whole story. Since most servers run Linux and most developers write code that actually runs on those servers, they need to have a consistent environment available to them that is similar to where they will run their code. Sure, this is achievable through virtual machines, Docker, and other virtualization tools, but it is significantly simpler to just run the code natively. Another thing in this use case is that if your code will be running on a machine running Linux, you need to know how to debug and fix your code on those machines when things inevitably do go wrong. Alright, let's move on to the next reason. Most developers actually prefer to use open source popular tools, and since Linux is absolutely the easiest platform to develop code for, the use of Linux becomes self-sustaining in a way. As an example, since so much developer software is written on Linux for Linux, most people use it to use the software. The sort of software I am talking about is stuff like Kubernetes, many continuous integration systems, build systems, integrated developer environments, and much, much more. Oh, and another thing, many engineers will try to automate things that are repetitive. One such task is setting up your developer environment on a new system. The Linux distribution package managers, along with Bash and other similar tools, make Linux super amenable to even the more complicated automation workflows. To be fair, Windows has recently created a package manager, but it's not super mature and its adoption will take a little bit of time. Next reason why developers use Linux is actually the command line interface that is available in all Linux distributions. If you do not use the CLI yourself, it may seem counterintuitive, but a developer that understands how to use the CLI will do most things much faster. This is since if you know the specific command, you do not have to wait for UI elements to load, make the program do a lot of other unnecessary things, and typing is much faster than dragging your cursor to places. Just for example, here is a screenshot of the process of installing Python on Windows. I can achieve this similar result with this single command in the terminal on my laptop. Alright, let's move on to the last 2 points. Remember how I said that the Linux kernel and Linux operating systems have seen wide adoption in academia? Well, the profs that adopted it started teaching students about Linux, and now most OS classes in universities across the world teach the course from the perspective of Linux. Therefore, it may be just a case of developers using what they know best and have been taught in classes. I mean, having gone through uni, I know so many people that use Linux as their development environment just because the university only used Linux in the classes. And now on to the last reason. And this may be the most shaky point yet. A lot of software engineers are simply tinkerers. Since Linux is so easy and fun to tinker with, and you already use it for work, why not play around with it on your own time? It is a somewhat fun way to occupy some of your time while learning genuinely useful skills for your work. Anyway, I do not think I have too many other reasons to really add here, so let's just wrap up the video. You know what? This video was really fun to make. I have been an avid Linux user for many years now, and it's actually my operating system of choice. So it is fun to put down a lot of things I know mostly off the top of my head about Linux into a video. I really hope that this video proved insightful to some of you. Whether it be the explanation of what Linux is, the example of the use cases of Linux itself, or the reasons that developers like to use Linux. Therefore, if you found this video useful, insightful, or just plain old interesting, then consider subscribing to my channel, and maybe even liking this video. That's all I had to say today. Thank you for your time. Bye.